Good afternoon, everyone. It is about to go 1 o'clock, and we will start officially then at 1. It is exciting to be able to host the psychology colloquium once again. We had taken a break last year for obvious reasons, but it feels good to be able to host the colloquium again, and we will do so online for this year as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, which will be Professor Desmond Painter in conversation with Professor Ashraf Kagee about his brand new book called By the Fading Light. If you haven't got your copy, please do get your copy, and perhaps even Ashraf can meet with you sometime to sign your copy, which I hope will be the case for me too, Ashraf. Yeah, your previous book, Khalil's Journey, is signed, and so I have to have this signed as well. So let me hand over to my two colleagues, who I'm sure can't wait to begin either. Thank you all for attending. And I'll hand over to the two of them, and I will monitor the chat function to see if any of you have questions. And Desmond, I think if people have, or if you ask for questions through the presentation, you can certainly field those. Otherwise, I'll help you monitor the chat function, and when we can get questions from people. So over to you, Desmond. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear. I see Floretta writing in the chat there. She can't hear anything. So I'm not sure. Ashraf, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Desmond.
Okay, cool.
Good afternoon.
Okay. There's a little bit of distortion from my side, but I can see you. Well, I could see you. Ashraf, are you back?
I'm right here.
Great. Okay, so let's start.
Perhaps
nice to see you, Ashraf.
To turn their cameras off.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I think we can go. So thanks for allowing me to do this, Ashraf. Once again, congratulations with the new novel, By the Fading Light.
Thank you.
I think you and I spoke about your first novel. When was that? Probably 2014 or something.
It was 2012, and it was at the Woordefeest, Desmond.
Is it long ago?
We had a spirited conversation that inspired me to write another novel.
Don't jump the gun now. I'm still going to ask you that question. So the first thing I wanted to say, actually, and this is just between us, the rest of them don't have to listen to this, but when you wrote the first novel, people told me, someone said to me in the corridor once, for those who don't know, we work in the same department, and someone said to me, Ashraf is publishing a novel, and I said, that's absolute nonsense. This cannot be. Ashraf certainly is not publishing a novel. And then you did publish a novel. I said to them, he's a new positivist guy. He doesn't write novels, and you did. And then sort of I had to deal with a cognitive dissonance, and I thought, okay, so Ashraf is basically a psychologist. He also wrote a novel, and now you've written a second novel. So now I have to sort of deal with the idea that maybe you're a novelist, actually, who's also a psychologist. Would you go along with this description of you now?
What an interesting question, Desmond. I consider myself more of a dabbler than a novelist. I kind of dabble in the area of creative writing when the spirit moves me and when the moment kind of takes me to do that. So I've never really thought of myself as a novelist. I'm kind of a writer, certainly an academic writer and a creative writer. And I think you're right in the sense that I do have a particular way of doing my work as a psychologist, and I hold certain ideas to be, fairly valuable. I'm essentially a neo-Popperian in a sense. I look for evidence and want things to be stated clearly and to be falsified, and falsifiable, etc. So that's my day job. And then when it comes to the night, and as the light fades, then I start to think of myself kind of more as a creative writer, because I find creative writing a liberating experience. Academic writing is very nice, and I enjoy it very much, but there are rules, and if you violate the rules without meaning to, people don't necessarily take you seriously. But with creative writing, you can intentionally violate rules. And in fact, there might not be any rules. And if there are rules, I make them up. And then I decide to break them if I like. And these include grammatical rules and rules about what is supposed to happen in a story, etc. So in that sense, it's a fairly liberating experience, essentially. And I find it a useful thing. So to answer your question, a novelist, well, I suppose objectively you can say that, but from my own point of view, I had no idea whether the second novel would be publishable and whether a publisher would find it acceptable. Fortunately, it did, and I don't have a good way of predicting whether a piece of creative writing is publishable in the same way that I kind of know when an academic manuscript will be publishable.
Desmond, are you still there?
I think we might have lost Desmond.
It has paused on quite a favorable picture of Desmond, so he doesn't have to worry about that. Let's see if I can try and get hold of him. Just hang on for a minute. Okay, so I'm just communicating with Desmond, and we'll resume shortly. It isn't a book launch without a technical difficulty, is it, Ashraf?
Yeah, that's right. Maybe I should just ad lib as we proceed. Or if anybody wants to ask a question in the chat, that's perfectly fine. One of the questions I do get asked is, where do I have the time to write? And it's a good question. Some people do things to amuse themselves, like they join a singing group, or they like to act, or they do other things. I find writing a pleasant hobby, I would say, and it's a kind of something I do on the side. And late at night, when everybody's gone to bed and it's completely quiet, I might write a page or two or three or four. And if one does it consistently, there is, at the end of the month, 30 pages, or at the end of 6 months, a fairly substantial amount of text to look at. So it's also important to be said that not everything that I write is useful and publishable, and a lot of it just needs to be deleted because it's not very good. So that's one of the things, that not everything that I write makes its way into publication. There's a question from Leslie. Thanks for your book. Please tell us why this book and why this period. And Desmond back. Well done, Desmond.
Sorry, I apologize, people, for going somewhere. I just had to get a drink. That's not really...
That's hilarious.
Yeah, where were we, Ashraf? Sorry. I was still asking you whether you're a novelist, and then I heard you say... I've interrupted you guys now. Sorry. Fill me in.
So I was saying that I'm more of a dabbler than a novelist, and I kind of do it as a hobby, and something that amuses me and that I find a little bit liberating from academic writing.
We can talk about the sort of psychology literature interface a bit later again, perhaps, but I just wanted you to say something about the novel itself. You don't have to give a summary of of the plot, but maybe just say something about where the novel comes from, the story and the development of the novel. How long have you been working on it? And
Desmond, I think you're breaking up a little bit again. I think your question ties in with Leslie's question a little bit as well. So how did I come to be writing this book, and why this time period, and why this particular story? I've always had a fascination with the 1950s and 60s for various reasons, because of the music, because of the social and cultural changes that occurred during this time. And I've often lamented the fact that I was born too late. I was born in 1965 when I should have been born in the 1940s and been one of those guys with the greasy hair and the leather jacket and the collar in the 50s, and then a hippie in the 60s. But of course, I was born, in a different time and came of age in the 70s and 80s. But I've also always listened to the music of the 50s and the 60s. And I think that 1960 was essentially a watershed year in South Africa when Sharpeville happened. The passive resistance movement was over, and it was a loss of innocence for the country, and what I was wanting to do, because the armed struggle would begin, and Nelson Mandela and the other Bravonia trialists went to jail, and there was a huge amount of political suppression in the 60s. So there was that loss of innocence, in a sense. I mean, this was a war, and it was a war against between the apartheid forces and the liberation forces and the people of South Africa. I was kind of, in retrospect, I think I was trying to draw a parallel between that loss of political innocence and the loss of innocence in the story of these young boys who experience these very difficult conditions and traumatic events that occur. So that was kind of the reasoning that I went through in locating the story in 1960. The rock and roll era was over, and the world was waiting for the Beatles, so to speak.
Yeah, that's exactly. I wanted to ask you about why you chose 1960, and this makes sense what you're saying. But I was wondering, one of the things I really like about the book is the kind of detail with which you write about Salt River, the characters, the experiences, and one of the nicest things about the novel is the sort of the texturedness of the narrative. And I was wondering about how you did that. Whether it feels like memory stuff, like you draw on your own memory. But it's set 5 years before, basically before your birth. And I was wondering how you approached this. Did you do research? Did you just mine your own memory?
A combination of both. I did have to do a little bit of research, but I also was fairly familiar with Salt River because I had family who lived there. I never lived there myself, but my grandparents lived there, and I spent a lot of time in this big, rickety, creaky old house with lots of people coming in and out, and with lots of activity. And I kind of was, for a period in my childhood, immersed in that cultural landscape of the time. It was a very interesting time because, in retrospect, there wasn't a lot of political activism, in the 60s and even in the 1970s. It was almost as if this community was going about its business, doing what it would do without a whole lot of immersion in what was going on politically. I never knew any political activists. Maybe later on, people became much more politically active in the 1980s, for example. But not so much during this time. And there was also almost I guess it's a question of looking at things in retrospect, but a tacit acceptance of political injustice, of segregation, of living on the other side of apartheid. This is just the way things are or were, and we accept. So at the time, I didn't, when I in the 70s, for example, I didn't get a sense of political urgency that there might have been in other communities.
Because it's one of the things you do well in the book. I think the sort of the broader historical frame is there, and the apartheid. You hint at it and you describe it, but it's sort of a frame within which the story plays out. But everyday life goes on, according to its own rhythms and its own logic, actually, and it's sort of framed by local, national, and international history, and it impacts, but it's not the main thing. So that was actually very interesting. It's also a story of childhood.
Desmond, one of the challenges of writing any South African story is how to deal with the politics, because it is not possible for me, at least, to write a South African story without taking into consideration the political context and how the politics of the day makes themselves felt in terms of the story. At the same time, though, stories of apartheid have been told many, many, many times. And if you make it yet another story of apartheid, I don't know if I can do anything new necessarily, So this is really a story about relationships. And it's a story about the internal worlds of these young boys who grow up, who face challenges in their families. The parents are struggling with their own grief and their own difficulties that they experience in their lives. And so they don't pay a whole lot of attention to the emotional needs of these young boys. And I wanted that to emerge in the story. Now, one of the points about my first book, Khalil's Journey, was that it was mainly character driven. The plot might have been there, but that wasn't the essential part of the book. So I thought I'd do something different here and make something very dramatic happen right in the first chapter. And then the rest of the story is about how the characters manage and deal with this very dramatic event that has taken place.
So it is a story about three boys, and it is to some extent a reflection on childhood, in a very particular time and place, but also a reflection on childhood as such, I think, as both a time of innocence, but it never is quite a time of innocence. You want to say something about childhood?
Yeah, look, I mean, and I suppose this is where my work as a psychologist might have some bearing. Children are often at the whim of those who hold power. And these are the parents and the elders and the teachers and the religious leaders, and the children have to go along with whatever they're being told to do. So in some sense, while children might be resilient and be able to manage many of these challenges that come up, there's also an element of vulnerability. And I think I wanted to capture that vulnerability, that tenderness. And these boys are just on the cusp of adolescence. They haven't reached puberty yet, and it's that moment just before adolescence in boyhood, which I think is a kind of a tender moment. It's a delicate moment. It's before the pimples come and the growth spurts and the facial hair and the interest in girls, and it's just before that. And then these events transpire in the book, which culminate in their realization that all is not as it seems, that the world is not necessarily a safe space and a safe place for them to be. And then they try to cope with this. They try to manage it, and they do so with the relationships with each other, with their friendships, with the music, with the food, with the cultural traditions, which I think is important. What doesn't happen for them, though, is very, very much is that they're not made to feel special. They're not made to feel special by the elders around them. And I was kind of thinking about this, and I thought, well, if they don't get made to feel special by their parents and others, then perhaps I, as a writer writing the story, can confer some specialness on them, on the characters.
Yeah, there's a lovely sentence in the book where you say they had seen what the world could do to a child. And I think that captures very well what you've just said. Was the book also a way for you to give something back to your own childhood, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, yes and no, I suppose. I think there are many things that go on when one writes, and to some extent, you know, one reflects on one's own experiences, and to another extent, you look at others around you and you think about what their internal worlds might be. And I was trying to, you know, put myself in the position of these young boys. I mean, the one boy, his mother died in childbirth and his father blames him. So, you know, that's a very difficult dynamic. That certainly didn't happen to me, but I was trying to immerse myself in such a scenario and to write from that perspective. Another of the boys, the family applies to the government to be reclassified as white because then they could move out of the neighborhood. And the rest of the family pass very well. But this little boy, he is subjected to the pencil test, and the pencil gets stuck in his hair, and so he doesn't pass. And that means the entire family has to remain. And he's made to feel guilty and ashamed because he didn't pass the pencil test. And what I was trying to do is show how a political system that is so cruel and dysfunctional and oppressive can make itself felt in the psychology of this young boy whose mother blames him. How could you have failed the pencil test? Your hair was too curly, you know. And the mother herself wanted to be white, and she aspired to that because whiteness was the norm and the criterion for acceptability. And I wanted to take issue with this. You know, this is what Marx called false consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like is because you present childhood, you know, the book is full of great vignettes and stories and boisterous fun. But childhood is a bit of a battleground, and these kids hold lots of family secrets, lots of regrets, and some of them are political in origin, and some are more just intrafamilial things.
Yes.
And I think that was really great. But I just said, you know, the two things that stand out for me in the book is the first is your attention to detail, the sort of texture, the care you give when you describe the place and the time, you know, the detail. And the other thing is your voice. You adopt a very particular kind of narrative voice in the book, and there's a lot of comedy. You know, you're very funny in it. You utilize your ability to tell dad jokes to great effect. Did you set out to write a comic novel or a book in which humor plays a particular role, or is that just, you know, accident?
I guess it's just me being me, I suppose. You know, it's a difficult story. It's a story where difficult things happen, and one can drag the reader through some harrowing plot. And, you know, I mean, some writers do that, and some readers like that. I wanted to avoid that particular way of writing and try to convey a sense of lightness, a sense of fun, and make it entertaining to the extent that I was able to, but at the same time tell a fairly serious story. And it's a serious story for a whole range of reasons, for political reasons, for interpersonal reasons, for psychological reasons. and to try to capture a little bit about the difficulties that families go through. Family challenges that might be idiosyncratic to certain cultures. For example, another boy in the book, his father takes a second wife, and in this particular religious cultural community, it is not illegal to have a second wife, or it's within the acceptable range. But his mother goes into a very deep state of distress as a consequence of this, because she's got this rival wife, she's got a co-wife. And what does that do to a family? How does that disrupt the rhythm and flow of this couple and this family? And the child is meant to now carry the weight of what his father had done.
But I think the use of humor in the book, I mean, I think it helps the reader, as you say. It's a story filled with trauma and tragedy to some extent. But it's more than that. I do think that the humor adds to convey an accurate view of how childhood is. You know, the kind of way that it can move out of the kind of the difficult moments into just pure crazy fun. And I think you sort of, yeah, I think you have quite a few scenes that are like there's a scene in the school with the teacher that kicks the desk and falls, which is just almost slapstick comedy. If you know, I think that's what you were getting at, to make the reader laugh.
Did it work, Desmond?
Yeah, I found it hilarious. I was going to ask that you read it, but I think it was maybe not a good idea. And then, of course, there was the funniest scene was the one where the boy walks in on the people who rent in their house, and he walks in on them having sex, and it's absolutely hilarious. So people should definitely read the book for the comedy as well.
I have to say that didn't happen to me ever, just so everybody knows. But I did have some very unusual teachers. I have to say that. Teachers who would, for example, confiscate the lunches of their pupils, you know, in the classroom. And there was a teacher at one of the schools that I went to who actually walked around the class on the pupils' desks, believe it or not. I mean, so there was that level of complete craziness that actually some of it is rooted in reality.
Cool. So say something to me about the music. Have you made a playlist for this book? Because it has a soundtrack. And there's a serious discussion going on throughout about authentic and non-authentic rock and roll, for example.
Yes. So just to pick up on what we were saying earlier, so the 1950s was a period of huge musical change. You know, you had people like Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and of course Elvis and Buddy Holly, who took the world by storm and changed everything completely. But by the late 50s, there was kind of a lull. You know, things had calmed down quite a bit, and by 1960, Buddy Holly had died in a plane accident, and Jerry Lee Lewis had married his cousin who was 13, and he was in disgrace, and nobody wanted to talk to him. And Little Richard, I think, joined the priesthood, and Chuck Berry was in jail, and Elvis was in the army or just coming out of the army. So there was that vacuum, that musical vacuum, that was then filled by these teen idols who just crooned and, you know, sang these meaningless songs. And it would be another couple of years before the Beatles would show up and again start another musical revolution. So there was that musical vacuum that I was trying to locate the book in. And again, as I mentioned to you, you know, we've often discussed before the importance of the music of that era, and the fact that the music reflected some of the cultural and social changes that occurred. Because later on in the 60s, I mean, internationally, the civil rights movement would begin in earnest in the United States, and Vietnam would happen, and the hippie movement would happen, and the Beatles would take over the world, and so 1960 was just before all of those things were taking place, and just after the musical revolution of the 1950s.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, both the Beatles and Bob Dylan debuted in 1962, and by then Elvis was very uncool. They've made him uncool. But these boys in the book, it's very important for them to identify with that kind of more edgy 1950s rock and roll. So they would be against Pat Boone and Cliff Richard, for example, and for the Elvis of 1956 and 1957. So that was interesting.
Yeah, so that's definitely kind of the way I would think of myself, as having more of an affinity to the edgy, fast rock and roll, which is, liberating. It's sexual. It's thumbing its nose at authority. It wants to shake things up. Where rather than being conformist, which people like Cliff Richard and Pat Boone and others, they wanted to fit in. They wanted to be sugar-coated and appealing and palatable to both the teenagers and their parents, whereas the early rockers didn't care, and Bob Dylan and the Beatles wanted to turn the world upside down, and the Stones, of course, which they ended up doing. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The characters also they identify with these early rock and roll, but they also, I think, at one point one of the characters says he hopes his mother or his grandmother don't realize that some of these guys are black. So it's interesting. There's also the kind of way that race and rock and roll is also interesting, and you hint at that in the book. So a lot of those early figures are black artists.
There is a point of view that rock and roll emerged from in African American communities and has its origins in slavery and etc. And certainly the rhythm and blues aspect of it was very much that. The person who owned Sun Studios in Memphis, Tennessee, spoke about the fact that rock and roll is the convergence of Black American music and white American music, the country and western music of white America and the rhythm and blues of Black America, and it came together and yielded this this very exciting form of music that young people especially embraced and took on, and it also represented a way of challenging authority. It was the Eisenhower period in the United States, and everything was very conservative and everybody knew their place, and certainly there were movements against segregation, but that only really took off in the 60s, and so I was trying to kind of capture some of the essence of that in the book, because music, I think, plays an important role in all our lives, whether you like music or not. You hear music on the radio. Your life as a soundtrack. There's certain kinds of music that conjure up memories for you, and the memories are emotional memories. And so music and emotion and feeling, all converge in a sense.
Mm-hmm. There's a sentence, and I couldn't find it again. I was just looking for it, where you say something. One of the characters says something about the vulgarity of death. I think that death is vulgar, and there's also a reflection on time in the book, where you say one of the sentences, time was a realist, an essentialist, a cold-eyed assassin of things imagined. It's a fascinating sentence for me. This kind of one of the saddest parts of the book maybe is not the content, but the sense of time inexorably moving on, and the inevitability of death, and time in a sense is a great equalizer, and it ends things, right? And it is unsentimental. And I was wondering whether, to some extent, is the aim of writing a book like this not in itself a kind of taking on time or a battle with time, because in some ways you're doing the impossibles. You're trying to reinvoke you're trying to experience and help us experience 1960, which is gone forever, right? And I was wondering why does one write a book like this? Isn't it to precisely try and sort of look time in the eye and stare it down?
Well, that's an interesting point of view and interesting, very perceptive. I think whoever tries to take on time will probably lose. But I think what I was wanting to do is have the narrator go back and examine the past, because the narrator is writing, reflecting on the past and writing about this, and his memory doesn't serve him very well, so he's reconstructing the past as best as he can, according to what he can remember, and then to think about what could have been. If I hadn't done this, what would my life have been? If I hadn't done that, what would my life have been? And to go back, and I think a lot of people do this. We all do this. We all think counterfactually. If I hadn't made this decision 10 years ago, where would I have been? If I hadn't made that decision, what would my life have been? And, in many ways, it's a futile thing. But a lot of people have regrets about the kinds of decisions that they might have made, etc. And if only I hadn't done that, and if only I hadn't done something else. So there was an element of that to try to restore the past, to try to kind of create a narrative of the past that is certainly attached to the events that occurred, but with a range of different feelings, a range of different thoughts, a range of different emotions and relationships. And, if only the story starts off with, if only this little boy had not taken the long way home after school that day. Because if he hadn't taken the long way home, if he had taken the short way home, all the events in the book wouldn't have transpired. And then, there would have been another set of events. But he didn't.
But I'm wondering whether, because maybe I disagree with you a little bit about how futile it is, because perhaps our ability to say what if, or to imagine alternative lives or parallel lives, in that sort of tension between what is or what happened and the reimagination, in that tension is a creative space for re-inhabiting time and place, and in some ways we do that as individuals, but you do that as a novelist as well. I mean, I think one of the things you managed to do in the novel is precisely to kind of to say, okay, time is an assassin of things imagined, but it is possible to reimagine it. So you suddenly give life again to this year 1960 in a small part of Cape Town. And maybe there's a link there with psychology again,
Yeah. Look, the business of counterfactual thinking has been the subject of academic study as well. And, especially with older people who reminisce about the past and think about it. And some memories are painful. Some memories are difficult. Some memories involve having to go there and think about things that happen that are not very pleasant, and then what does that do to someone who's doing the remembering, and is it worth it? Is it worth remembering painful things? Sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it's not. And then of course there's pleasant things to remember, but the pleasant things happened a long time ago. They're no longer with us. And so there's an element of wistfulness, I think, that I was trying to also put my finger on. The laughter and the fun and etc. And so that's kind of a poignant thing, that we had some good times, but those times are gone, in a sense.
Yeah, so maybe at that, having said that, perhaps you can say something about the title of the book, By the Fading Light, which in itself is a kind of, there's a certain wistfulness in the title. And is it often in the book, there are references to things happen at the end of the day when light fades, and sometimes ominous things, and sometimes homecoming and good things. How did you come up with the title, and did you sort of build in those references in it, or did the title suggest itself as you were writing the book?
What I wanted to do when I was writing the book, especially when I wrote the very first draft, was to capture a sense of foreboding, a time when that is eerie, that is sinister, that is makes one uneasy, and when the light starts to fade, when it becomes twilight, when it becomes dusk, it's neither night nor day, and strange things can happen. The parents call their children to come inside because they don't want them out at night, and that's the time when they must come home. And I did try to hint at some supernatural things, like the jinns. The jinns are out at night, and these are evil spirits or supernatural spirits. And this book is by no means a supernatural book at all. It's very much rooted in, Desmond, in empirical reality.
I've noticed.
But I did want to hint at some otherworldliness, that there might be a world beyond what we can see and touch and feel and hear, and this is where the jinns live, and where magic can happen, and where unexplained things can occur that might have a bearing on the state of affairs in the world that we inhabit. I did want to hint at that. But it's not about that really. I wanted the reader to I wanted to pique the reader's interest and imagination and kind of tease the reader a little bit without going into too much detail.
Mm-hmm. So, at this point, I think you've already said something about how perhaps being a psychologist might have influenced how you think about childhood or the context of the family. But I'm still wondering, you say you're a dabbler and you do this stuff at night when you're not busy doing the serious psychology writing and so on. But I want to know, have you not experienced that this infects your psychological thinking or writing in any way? As writing novels, in other words, has it changed the way you think about an approach?
I think it makes me enjoy words and language, and I try to frame things in a way that is a little bit different from how one would ordinarily phrase things, and to try to put a spin on a description that might not occur to me when I'm speaking necessarily. And to try to write with a little bit of a higher register, even though I'm discussing very mundane events, and it's trying to capture the essence of something with words with a little bit of creativity that I find quite pleasant and quite enjoyable. I don't know if writing a book has changed me in any way. It's made me very bored with having to read drafts of the same manuscript over and over and over again, looking for errors and mistakes, and wanting to make sure that the story actually hangs together and is coherent. It's like if something happens in the first chapter, you need to resolve the problem at some point. Like Chekhov's gun on the mantelpiece. At some point, the gun needs to go off, and if it doesn't go off, well, what do you put the gun there for? So the story needs to be internally consistent. And sometimes when one is doing free writing and just pouring out words, you don't really attend that much to whether it makes sense or not. But at a certain point in the story, things do need to make sense, and they do need to add up, and you can't leave the reader with too many loose ends, because it's not satisfying for either the reader or the writer.
I hear you. I still think that in the book you have a very good eye for detail and for space and the characteristics of a particular place and time, and I think those things are things that could easily translate into psychological type of writing. So that's why I'm trying to convince you to become an ethnographer, I guess.
Yeah, look, I think what I was trying to do is explore the internal worlds of these young boys, at least in the first part of the book. The second part of the book is very much event driven, but in the first part of the book I was trying to look at the world from their point of view, from these 11-year-old boys' perspective, and to experience some of the challenges, some of the pain, some of the pathos that they might have experienced, being kind of on the receiving end of this power dynamic between their elders and themselves, and having to navigate their way through this challenging world in which they found themselves, and also the very severe, difficult event that took place in this community.
Yeah.
Because that's what the story is about.
Okay, so I mean, I think it has changed you as a person. I like you more every time you write a book, so it does change you a little bit. Okay, Ashraf, maybe at this point, I see it's 1:45. Maybe we can ask the audience, if they're still there, if anyone has a question or a comment that they would like to direct at you, if you don't mind.
Sure. I hope people are still here.
I don't know. Maybe it's just us. Anyone out there? I don't see any questions in the chat here.
We are still here, and there are, hello, it's Bronwyn again. We are still here, but amazingly, a lot of the questions asked here you've brought up. For example, there was just a similar question that Rizwana had, which was on, has your creative writing had any influence on your academic work, which Desmond, you've just asked Ashraf. And then Leslie also asked, can you tell us about the book and why this time period, which Ashraf, I think you spoke about earlier. And then there's also a question here, what was your inspiration for writing this novel? I don't know if you want to talk more about that, Ashraf.
That's a good one.
Yeah, my inspiration for writing this book, there wasn't any single event that inspired me. I sat down and I thought to myself, what can I say that's interesting and that can amuse me personally as a writer? And that was my first, the matter that drove me, the enjoyment of putting words on the screen. In the old days, it used to be paper, but now we write on a laptop. And to see those words and to enjoy writing those words and massaging those words into a narrative, I think that, and it could be any story really. The plot actually may be less important, but the story is interesting. The story about feelings, about emotions, about relationships, about difficulties, about challenges, and those are the things that kind of inspired me to want to capture this ethereal phenomenon of an emotion, of a feeling, and to put it down. Stephen King, the writer, says that writing is telepathy. You communicate from your own mind to the mind of the reader. And then, someone like Jacques Lacan would say that, the text is the communication of the unconscious of the writer to the unconscious of the reader. I'm not sure if I'd go that far, but certainly it is a sense of wanting to communicate with the readership these issues, these feelings, these things that you can't easily put your finger on ordinarily, and that was the challenge for me, to try to take this feeling of wistfulness, this feeling of poignancy, and to try and capture it in a set of words and write about it. And of course, it's for the reader to decide whether I did that successfully or not. Lumeri says, I'm happy that you talk about the unconscious. Can I make a comment about this?
Yes.
So I look, in my own day job as a psychologist, I certainly acknowledge that there is possibly an unconscious, but that's not the crux of my work. But as you know, in literature, if you go to English departments, if you go to departments of literary studies, Freud plays a huge role. Freud is a literary figure, and I think I would maybe take my hat off to Freud for bringing into focus the importance of these internal dynamics that occur among people. As I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of more of an empirical scientist as a psychologist, and so if something is not testable and falsifiable, I'm more skeptical. But in the writing field, in the field of literature, by all means, let's talk about the unconscious and let's talk about these, dreams. In the book, there's a piece where these young boys have a trance-like state, where they reflect on the experience of slavery, for example, and that experience makes its way into the story in that way.
Ashraf, can you see the chat here? So Leslie asked a question. Ashraf, each of your characters is dealing with loss, and the book starts with a big loss. Can you tell us a bit about this as a theme of the book?
Yes, I think I wanted to show that everybody experiences challenges in their lives, including loss. The community suffers a loss. And in fact, loss is an important theme. The country goes through what might be called a loss of innocence. The community goes through what might be a loss of innocence with this very dramatic event that occurs. And these children have a loss of their innocence, and it's not sexual innocence as much as it's kind of a growing awareness and acceptance of the fact that the world can be a very dangerous place and is not a safe place, and our assumptions might not be correct about this world. So there is a strong theme of loss in this book. If you write a book only about pleasant things, I don't think a lot of people necessarily want to read it. So you need to have a problem to solve. You need to have some kind of challenge that the characters go through. And then the question is, how do they manage it? How do they navigate it? How do they negotiate it? And that is, that's the story. They might not do it successfully. They might not do it well, but they get through it. And the question is how.
Ashraf, and then there are two questions here about, the one is, who are some of the writers you admire? And I'm interested in what novels inspire you. If you could talk to that.
Yes. When I was younger, I read all the classics, of course, Homer and, etc. And then, of course, all the books that we were required to read at school. But I think what this book might have in common with, and I'm certainly not comparing it at all, but just in terms of childhood themes, would be To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, for example, and The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini. It's kind of in that genre of a childhood tale, a childhood fable, written from the perspective of an adult. So that's one set of writers, and then I've read a lot of Salman Rushdie's books, and I'm very perplexed by him because some of his writing is brilliant, and other parts of his writing are incomprehensible to me, at least. And so he's a challenging writer, but he's also quite an entertaining writer. And if anyone hasn't read Midnight Children, then I think it's probably one of the books that should be read by other people. And then, when I was younger, I read a lot of books by Stephen King and James Hadley Chase, those pulp fiction types of books, which is also fine. You don't only have to read, the classics.
And then there's a question, any plans to do a children's book?
I haven't thought about that, but one of the publisher actually, that's Umesh. Hi, Umesh. The publisher said that this particular book by The Fading Light could be thought of as young adult, young adult fiction, which is entirely possible. And if there's any way that it could be read by school kids, that would be wonderful.
Any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know, Bronwyn, am I missing something?
No, you've covered everything. Everything seems to be covered here, yeah. Ashraf, I guess, I suppose the other question you must be getting all the time is is will there be another novel?
Yes, there's a question
Yeah,
about
and that's where I seek refuge in my identity as a dabbler. So, every once in a while, I try to find time to write this or that or the other. Whether it makes its way into publication is another matter altogether. Um, if I may make a confession, after Khalil's Journey was published, I did write another book, but it wasn't really very good, and so it's there to remind me of the fact that my efforts might not necessarily be successful, and I probably will write another book. I'm quite interested in the story of slavery because it's not a matter that has been discussed a whole lot in South Africa. Apartheid has just eclipsed everything. But before apartheid, people came from different parts of the world as slaves to South Africa, and I want to try and tell that story a little bit. Again, whether a publisher thinks it's useful is not for me to judge.
It's also a book that's set in Cape Town very explicitly, and I was wondering whether you consciously read or looked at other Cape Town novels, or whether that was not part of your project.
I did. I mean, I've read several books. I'm thinking of the writer Rada Jacobs, for example, and Richard Reeve as well. And Sean Phil has written a wonderful biography of Richard Reeve, and I almost think the biography is better than Richard Reeve's books himself. I really admire Sean's work. So yeah, for sure I have. Desmond, you mentioned your grandfather had a house or great-grandfather had a house in Salt River.
Yeah, that was sort of turn of the previous century, so late 1890s until the early 1900s. I forget the exact address, but I went to, during lockdown, I started walking around Salt River and places like that a lot. So it's very interesting. I mean, the kind of the history, I don't know that much yet about the history of the neighborhood, but it's very interesting. And I see there's another question here. What do you think about writing for a different medium like film or TV so that it appeals or can reach a larger audience? I think you should definitely write a movie script, Ashraf.
Yeah, I actually have no idea how to do that, and I'd need to get a manual or a how-to book to see how I would. One of the big problems I find is writing dialogue, and writing dialogue that is captivating and witty and interesting and etc. And so I think writing for film and TV requires developing dialogue, to a fairly high level. It is a challenge for me. It's easier for me to tell a story rather than to show two people talking to each other. But that's kind of an area that I'd like to become better at, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Bronwyn, I don't know. There's another question. Let's do this one last question.
Okay.
It's a comment. Oh, there's another question. Oh no, that's just comments. Okay, I don't know. Sorry, Bronwyn, maybe we should call it.
Yes, I think we should call it. I think I can see people also having to attend to their other meetings. So I would like to thank both you and Ashraf for what was really a very engaging and interesting talk. And Ashraf, congratulations once again. We will all eagerly anticipate that next novel. And no pressure. We know how busy you are. So thanks very much. Thank you to everyone who attended and for all the interesting questions. We look forward to seeing you next week when we speak to Professor Leslie Swartz on his book called How I Lost My Mother. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much, Desmond. I so appreciate this, and to the department. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.